Liberal Currents presents Half the Answer with your hosts, Caitlin M. Green and Trent R. Nelson.
Well, happy days are here again. That's what they keep telling me. And today's another happy day to talk about a happy topic. I am Caitlin Green. This is Half the Answer. We have our host, Trent R. Nelson here, historian, philosopher, writer, editor, man about town, hat wearer, of course. Yeah, that's right. Flaunt it, work it, show it. And I am, of course, a linguist, editor, and writer at Liberal Currents as well. And Trent, who have you brought me?
Well, again, sometimes we just have such wonderful conversations with folks on terrible topics that we've got to do her again. Well, this time we're talking with Mr. Steven Monacelli. You remember him just like we do. He writes all over Texas. He's ensuring that you know that, well, there's some bad stuff going on with ICE. There's bad stuff going on all over. But Steven, well, it's a pleasure to have you back, sir. But recently, you've been doing some work with anti-Vaxx movement. Is that correct?
Yeah, I not too long ago, I guess about a month and a half at this point, put out a podcast series with Cool Zone Media, which is through iHeartRadio. They have a bunch of great shows, including Behind the Bastards, It Could Happen Here. And so I did a 5-episode series for It Could Happen Here, detailing the deeper history of anti-vaccination politics in the United States and how that thread continues right up into the present, and what's different, but also what's the same about the anti-vaccination movement that we're seeing is alive and well today.
And you actually hinted this at the end of our last episode, for any of our listeners who were keeping their ears peeled. Well, Steven, this is a really interesting topic. I've done a bit of research on it myself, of course, because it is not new. We've been dealing with this for just about as long as people have been trying to keep folks safe from illnesses. George Washington was inoculating his troops. That was before the smallpox vaccination at the end of the 18th century. What did your research show you about the movement, about the history, of course, leading us up to modern times where we have a lot of the cures or the remedies to make sure that we don't get sick, yet seem to refuse to want to involve ourselves with them?
Right. Well, you're correct. Resistance to vaccinations goes back as long as vaccinations have existed. And you could argue even prior to that. Some people talk about inoculation as a part of the discourse around the anti-vaccination movement. And it's like it's not a minor scientific quibble, but it is a distinction that inoculation and vaccination are two different things, even though inoculation kind of led to vaccination. And so you're correct that in the Revolutionary War period, inoculation was already common, and that President Washington, or I guess not really president at that time, but George Washington, General Washington encouraged, and actually enforced inoculation, and that there was resistance to it, and some of that early resistance had a religious flavor to it. Right. With regard to corrupting the body and, kind of doing something against God's will, so to speak. Right. And other objections to it were also more rooted in what you could just loosely describe as medical freedom, which is a parallel set of ideas that sometimes intersect with the religious ideas as well. And so as inoculation moved towards vaccination, the first vaccine had been developed for smallpox in the late 1700s, and it continues apace. And England, the United Kingdom, really kind of led the way in the early days of passing and enforcing laws around vaccination requirements. And this also spurred some responses, some protests, some unrest around this. And the first anti-vaccination leagues came out of the United Kingdom. Eventually, one formed in the United States, and that was actually in part through the efforts of the founder of the Anti-Vaccination League in the United Kingdom. And so it jumped the pond and started to spread in the United States. And they actually had some victories in the early years. They were able to convince some state legislatures to pass legislation, basically making compulsory vaccination illegal or getting rid of that. And that was really the main thing that caused a lot of resistance in the early era, was this idea that vaccination was compulsory or was required, and that you could be fined or have some other charges laid on you if you were to resist that. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, conscientious objectors, kind of that notion emerged in part out of resistance to vaccinations.
Wow.
And so that continued for quite some time, for a few decades, and then the pendulum started to swing in the other direction. And there's some Supreme Court cases, there's some federal court cases that started to kind of make it difficult for the anti-vaccination movement, because the courts would uphold, in some instances, these requirements to be vaccinated. Because when you think about individual health decisions, whether you get a surgery or whether you take a certain medication that is directed at symptoms, that's kind of one thing. And I think most people can agree that you shouldn't force people to take certain types of treatments if it's that purely an individual issue. But when it comes to things like communicable diseases, it's a community issue, it's a public health issue. And so that kind of became the crux of the matter. And around coinciding with the Great Wars, we started to have more and more nations as well as states imposing various forms of compulsory or mandatory vaccinations. And that, in part, you could say was due to the war effort, but also the science was improving over time. And we were able to understand with greater certainty that these vaccines have great benefits, and the risks of getting vaccinated are much lower than the risks of getting smallpox or getting measles or getting any of these, communicable diseases that for decades, for centuries, killed so many people, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, depending on how many illnesses you're really counting. And so the resistance, though, it didn't go away, and it kind of moved to the fringe of politics and of religion and a few other things. But if we look back at some of the motivating reasons for anti-vaccination, so there's the two I mentioned: religious beliefs, there's medical freedom, but then there were also some really bad things. Like there was conspiratorial thoughts, there were particularly anti-Semitic arguments being made with regard to this push for vaccinations. People would, from Germany to the United States and in Canada, would argue that Jewish doctors are trying to bamboozle you and to make you pay for things that you shouldn't pay for, or that you don't need, or that are maybe even dangerous to you. And so if you consider all of those ideas that were percolating in the anti-vaccination movement at the time, in addition to their embrace of homeopathy and other alternative forms of treatments that aren't quite backed by scientific evidence, you can see all of that today. It's like an echo, it's a consonance, it's a continuation of the same sorts of ideas that we saw early on. And we've just now kind of gone through a period of time in which, in the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, vaccines were so widely embraced that we eradicated the spread of numerous deadly diseases. Yeah. So we've had whole generations of people who have never even encountered someone who had polio. We've got whole generations of doctors who've been trained who've never encountered a patient with measles. Yeah. And so we're now in this place where, like, you know, the historical memory of all that stuff is weaker. People have fewer direct connections, familial connections to the impact of these diseases. And so this rhetoric has more fertile ground to
Right.
root in. And you know, we haven't even gotten to the more recent history, but you know, I think
We'll
post
get there.
2020, yeah, post 2020, all of this has been supercharged.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, uh, thank you for the history, Stephen.
Yeah.
There's a great book, Pox by Michael Wilrich, um, written in about 2012. And he does a lot of that same history, actually, Stephen, going from really the development of the smallpox vaccine, which was a multi-decade effort by people from across Europe. And then you get into like the sort of minutiae of like the different strains of smallpox and how the Ottomans had been inoculating for centuries, right? Like by the time Washington's doing it, it's already like 4 or 5 centuries old. Um, but there develops, as so often happens, minor and major variants of smallpox, right? And so, like this innovation actually, it is a positive thing for people because the minor variation is much less deadly than the major variation, except that it also because smallpox is actually, and this is something that because we eradicated smallpox, we don't even think about. The smallpox vaccine was like the only vaccine that was actually like somewhat like dangerous. Like they did not recommend everybody get the smallpox vaccine, which is why the way that they killed smallpox is in this really tripped out international way. The Russians and the United States, they like partnered on it during the Cold War. It's like some of the coolest history. But they would like target vaccines. So like when there were cases in a place, they would go around and they would vaccine like a perimeter to like try to like almost contain the illness into a minor location, right? But like I think that as you noted, as we get further away from all of that, we sort of lose um, touch with why these things were created, why there was like lines in the streets to get these sort of cures because of how terrible it is. But I mean, let's move to now.
I just was thinking about smallpox, like I do. So coming from the Southwest, I feel like a lot of our like the activities that you send children to do have to do with like the Old West. And I feel like smallpox was a real character in the Old West stories that they would tell us when we would go to like Tombstone or wherever. And I was just wondering if people who didn't grow up in the Southwest, like that wasn't part of your children's stories, was the smallpox epidemic. That's so weird.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no dysentery was in our Oregon Trail. I can't remember smallpox was
Yeah.
something that could kill your, you know, caravan in that game.
Yeah.
Right.
Fortunately, now as an Oregon resident, I can just use a bridge and I don't have to like,
Ford the
risk
river.
contaminated water, yeah, or losing my oxen or whatever.
Right. But that's a good question. I mean, I how many I mean, we learn about this briefly in school, but I mean, how much do children really get exposed to the Spanish flu epidemic,
Right.
you know,
Right.
and what happened there, and how many people died, and
For me,
what the responses were like.
I just remember learning as a little girl that like smallpox would mar your face, and I was like, I would become ugly. Well, I cannot handle this, right? Because I am vapid and shallow, I guess.
Oh, yeah, all children are vapid and shallow. But it's funny you bring that up, Steve, because the Spanish flu, of course, American, obviously.
Yeah, but we've all
Well,
seen Downton Abbey, so now we care, right?
we've all seen Downton Abbey. We had a lot of the same responses in terms of a masking movement during the Spanish
Mhm.
influenza, and also a anti-mask
Yeah.
movement. You see, when I was reading about that during COVID, actually, I was
Right.
stunned at how similar our responses are across 100 years.
Yeah, it was like, I have rights, and also it's hard for me to breathe, right? It's uncomfortable.
Right. Right. I mean, I quoted this in the podcast, and I think this really hits the nail on the head.
Please.
In 1920, in Seattle, so right on the heels of, I guess not the heels, immediately following the Spanish flu epidemic, which killed so many people, smallpox arrived in Seattle. And like 900 children came down with it despite vaccination requirements and quarantine requirements. And so the city's health officer, his name was Dr. Hiram Reed, estimated at the time that 95% of those kids who caught it were unvaccinated. And in a report, he went on to complain, quote, that the city's a hotbed for anti-vaccination, Christian Science, and various anti-medical cults, and it's difficult to enforce vaccination. Now, Christian Science doesn't necessarily loom super large in the American consciousness now, even if it has been a significant movement in America for some time and still exists.
So I went to college at University of Washington in Seattle. That was where I did my undergrad. In fact, I'm wearing my Huskies outfit right now.
Hey.
But I actually do remember walking by a lot of Christian Science reading rooms, even in 2010, and being like, "What's this about?"
they're around. Yeah, they're still around. They're still an entity. They have these reading rooms in major cities across the country.
We have one here.
Not, yeah, but they're not. They're not the group that you think of when you think of the modern conservative Christian anti-vax movement.
Yeah,
right.
And you could maybe argue that some of that stuff was percolated or kind of created in the Christian Science movements or its adjacent movements, but broadly speaking, within Christianity, particularly conservative Christianity in the United States, there's a variety of different strains that tend to embrace the idea of miracles, the idea of supernatural healing. So whether they're Pentecostal or charismatic or a more specific type of thing like Christian Science, there's this embrace of a notion that you don't need this medical stuff in order to heal or for God to take care of you. And some go so far as to say that actually doing that stuff could be harmful to you and might even be some sort of betrayal of your faith, or intimate that you don't believe that God will take care of you or that God doesn't have a correct plan for you.
I mean, it's not even just Christianity that does this, right? That's like God. So there's some like thing that you should be doing correctly, and then your body will react, by protecting you. Like even things like The Secret, right? Or all of those, what are they called? The law of attraction kind of ideologies, right? The idea being that like, well, if you get sick, it's because you were thinking sick thoughts, or because you interfered with God's plan, or because, whatever it is.
So there's like a individualization of it. There's like a moralization of it. And it's bound to this sort of magical thinking that is not, exclusive to Christianity, but for the purposes of understanding the American anti-vax movement, you can't talk about it without talking about the intersection with conservative Christianity. And we look at places in Texas where there are private schools run by churches, and some of them have shockingly low vaccination rates, like below 10%, below 20%. And in some instances, they're proud of this, and they will beat their chest about it and say, "Oh, we're celebrating our embrace of medical freedom." And so to not talk about the role of religion is, I think, to miss a huge part of the story, particularly one that goes back very long and has been a part of the anti-vaccination movement since its inception.
Yeah.
Right. And again, what always strikes me is when we get into this discussion, Edward Jenner would have laughed at the concept of medical freedom being that which allows for you to get sick. He would have argued vehemently, I suspect, that medical freedom is the sort of freedom that is provided to you by having something like a vaccine within access. You are then
Right.
free of having to worry about, am I going to get the minor strain? Am I going to get the major strain? Am I
Well,
going to get sick? Am I going to
yeah.
get my family sick, et cetera, et cetera?
And when it comes to children, this is what always gets to me about the like parents' rights movements too, where it's like, okay, I'm exercising my medical freedom by depriving my children of the right to be protected, right, from illness or from abuse or from whatever, right? Where it's like, I don't think that, as a parent to two children, I don't think that my rights extend that far over them, right? Where I shouldn't I shouldn't be allowed to deprive them of things that they are entitled to as humans: education, physical safety, medical protection, but of course that's easy for me to say because I do vaccinate them all on time.
Right.
Yeah, what you're getting at, Trent, is, classic difference between a negative and a positive notion of freedom. And, one being that you can't make me do something and that's my freedom. And then another being, I can't be free. I can't really have freedom to act without certain things, without certain supports or
Right.
certain, rights or opportunities. And yeah, I think that is a huge distinction between those who embrace public health programs that involve vaccines and those that are resistant to them. Something else that we also have to talk about is that the history of vaccines, unfortunately, is somewhat intertwined with the history of eugenics. And that some of the proponents of vaccines have been eugenicists, but then also confusingly, some eugenicists were like anti-vax because they were concerned that by vaccinating everyone, you would be short-circuiting the evolutionary process.
Mhm.
And by civilization's suspension of the evolutionary process, we are allowing for the weak
Right.
and the
We
unfit
don't we
to
don't want to
spread.
prolong the lives of the undesirables so that they can now procreate and create more undesirables, right?
Right,
That would be
right.
so dangerous.
So on the one hand, you had that, and you can even see that kind of thinking today.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, we also had terrible incidents, terrible historical examples like the Tuskegee experiment, which, purported to vaccinate Black men and then did not intentionally to see
Yeah.
whether they would develop syphilis in the same way that white people would. And big surprise, they have the same central nervous system, they have the same physiology.
Yeah.
It's not different, so it happens all the same. And
Right.
that was the great conclusion that they came to. But in the
Hooray.
process, they, it was based on one, eugenicist assumptions that there would be a difference.
Yeah.
And then two, it created this, horrible, horrible breach of trust,
Right.
particularly within a minority community that
Yeah.
hasn't forgotten about it
No.
Right.
and, continues to face inequity with regard to interactions with the healthcare system
Yeah.
and, not being attended to in the way that they should be. And so consequently, yeah, we've got skepticism among minority communities as well, who may or not even tend conservative, quote unquote, or right wing in their beliefs, but are deeply skeptical of anything that the state might impose upon them as a medical intervention because of this, history of abuse or lack of support. And so, it's so twisted that we now then have people like RFK Jr. and the organization he used to lead putting out, basically propaganda films targeting that community and saying, this is why you shouldn't get the COVID vaccine. And then simultaneously, they're associating themselves with people who are basically like race scientists or eugenicists and in themselves. And so we, this is all to say that it's just as like twisted and contradictory today as it was in the 1800s
Right.
and the early 1900s.
Right.
Because eugenics is biting us on both sides, basically. Like, it's that's awful.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing, we mentioned RFK Jr. The recently there was a shooting at the CDC, right? And one person died, and the the way that RFK Jr. has had to respond to it is so interesting, right? Because the guy was clearly responding to an ideology that RFK Jr. promotes, where, you know, the shooter believed that the COVID vaccine had made him mentally ill and was giving him like body pain, and he wanted to punish the CDC for causing that. And so RFK Jr. would agree with that, probably, that like he was vaccine injured. However, because he's the head of HHS, he has to come out and be like, oh, it's really, the CDC is full of heroes who are doing hero things, and I really feel for them, and I'm so sorry to them, right? Where he truly does have to 180 contradict himself now, because he can't publicly go out and be like, you know, he obviously those guys are devils. I've been saying it for years.
Right. It's a bit of a fox in the henhouse situation.
Right.
Yeah, really.
Right. Again, though, I am struck by sort of, when we had our eugenics discussion with Rebecca Sear a few episodes ago, Plato came up a lot, obviously, as he's wont to do, and it's the same type of
when
thing.
you're on the podcast, he is.
Well, unfortunately, I'm always on the podcast.
Other podcasts don't have this problem, Trent.
Well, we'll have to investigate that on the next episode. Is that Plato talks about the sort of like the eugenics society should not necessarily be focused on like healing and fixing people, because like a good strong society has like good naturally strong people in it. So if you breed people well, they won't get all of these illnesses, right? And so they wouldn't need vaccines. They wouldn't need something like this. We're just coddling the weak. I mean, again, it's all nonsense, obviously, but that is sort of, as Steve has been talking about, that's sort of the main route that we're going on, is just nonsense stacked on top of each other until
we're going to create a strong folk, a strong populace by weeding out the weak, right? And we're not going to achieve that if we protect them from illnesses. And RFK Jr. has been explicit about that, right? Where he's like, hey, healthy people will be fine.
Yeah. Well, and there's more to it than that. I think there's the invocation of a moral responsibility to not just be fine, but to be the one in control of your health, and that you are able to even do that. And there's a comparison that we made on the podcast. I was speaking to Dr. David Gorski about this, and he brought up the idea of the Volk in Nazi Germany, and this idea that there's this body populace, the nation has a body, and all the individuals that make up this national body are kind of the cells, so to speak, and it's their responsibility to be the best, strongest cells possible. And also the weak ones and the unfit ones will be cast off in order to purify this national body and purge it of any illness, any perceived illness. And so you can see, if you label a whole category of people as an illness, that's obviously going to go in a really, really bad way. But also, if even if we don't do that, if we propose that only the strongest will survive and that it's our responsibility to be the strongest, I mean, yes, we all should eat healthy and exercise and do things that are good for our bodies, but you can do all of that and still end up getting some sickness, some illness, some disease. You can get cancer. You can have any of these things happen to you, and it's not necessarily your fault. And even in instances where it's like, oh, that person smoked for 60 years. It's like, well, the fucking tobacco companies have been doing propaganda and lying about what they know is a dangerous substance. And then we have a system of governance that allows for this to occur. And then we blame the people that it occurs to. And so, all of this is really toxic. It's a really bad way to think about how we should take care of a population. And it dovetails with stuff that was being discussed 100 years ago, where these eugenicists were not only concerned about the spread of unfit people and how, sanitation, running
Right.
water, all these things were, allowing for the rabble to continue to live. And some would even directly tie that to the rise of communism or the rise of leftist
Right.
ideologies. And that, then it's one step away from it's all a Jewish cultural Marxist conspiracy.
Right.
Yeah, it's
And
all
like
right
the
there.
ultimate goal of that conspiracy is, of course, to weaken us, right? By seeding the degeneracy and
Right.
making us
It's
easy to conquer, right?
it's to weaken our proud Anglo culture or Protestant Anglo-Saxon culture, and weaken it so that it can then be overtaken by this perceived alien, population that is
Right.
Oh, this international
Yeah.
cabal.
rootless
Ruthless.
international cosmopolitan cabal that
Yeah.
wants to eradicate all
Right.
difference in our culture. So yeah, I mean, like, once you get on a certain path with this stuff, it can be really easy for people to then just be shunted along right to that sort of conclusion.
How
And
many ways has man conceived of hinting at Judaism without having to say it? Like,
We
how
have
many
so
different
many.
ways?
Yeah. And then you get into like globalists, which is everywhere. And you're like, geez, like you learn about globalism as a concept, and that's like a real thing. And then somebody is like, how about if I turn that into a noun to describe people? And then immediately the red flags have to go off of like, dude, stop.
Yeah.
Globalists.
Yeah. So, and then of course, we've got this like contradictory relationship where, there are people who are also anti-vax, and maybe they don't believe the whole hog of the anti-Jewish conspiracy stuff, but they're very Christian, and then they're, leaning into their support of Israel, but oftentimes that's because they want there to be a Jewish state there to then trigger the apocalypse. And
Right.
so, there's all this really complicated stuff that's colliding here. And, what I feared would happen is already happening with the administration. I mean, we talked about, the concern is that we're just going to see a steady dismantling of all of our, apparatus, all of our systems for approving new vaccines, distributing vaccines, and cutting, research to mRNA vaccines. That's one avenue.
What, $500 million in grants and contracts canceled. A bunch of labs, their projects just like out of funds, can't do it. And it was all about using mRNA to apply it to other diseases as well as COVID, right? And then also like the bird flu vaccine research has been halted. Like just so much research that we desperately need right now. And this is the part where I have to really like live up to my promise not to yell, because as I mentioned before, my kids are 3 and 6. I'm freaking the fuck out. Right? I'm not happy about this. And I've already like called the doctor, like, what do I do? What do I do? And they're like, well, we'll call you if we have anything, right?
Right.
I have a doctor who's like very on top of things, a pediatrician, right? Who is like with me on this and is not gonna sugarcoat, but is also not gonna hold things back. And that's really nice. But like, I still feel fairly helpless, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that is an unfortunate consequence of where we're at. And the main difference that I can point to with the modern anti-vaccination movement compared to the historic one like 100 years ago is that they've never had this level of power ever before. It's never been that anti-vaxxers like of this level of commitment have had this much state power. The closest that maybe we could point to would be when Nazi Germany started actually rolling back some of their vaccination requirements that had been put in place during the Weimar period. And, people will ironically often point to the Nazis as the ones that are, like you'll see the anti-vax imagery where they're taking the vaccine needles and making a swastika out of it. But that's like a total misunderstanding of the Nazis' own history when it comes to the vaccination movement. So you know, it is really sad that we've gotten to this point of polarization on this issue where the history is totally misappropriated, it's misunderstood, and it's applied in ways that are, I mean, they're just deeply offensive,
But
frankly. So
but
I don't know how we get out of this. I mean, like, communication around this obviously is important. Education around science is obviously important, but I fear that we may not really turn a corner on this
no.
until there's another mass casualty event, specifically one that kills children. Because I
Yeah.
think one of the things about COVID was that it caused a lot of trouble for families because of school closures. I think that was something that we can acknowledge, but it didn't kill kids in the same
Right.
way that other diseases have in the past. I mean, the amount of resources that have gone into trying to solve child cancer, for example, immense, and rightfully so. No one wants to see children die of cancer.
Right.
But that all being said, I mean, that's like a relatively small percentage of children compared to the percentage of children that could be at risk for developing deadly communicable illnesses. And that's not even talking about like the long-term disabilities that people can get from having serious cases of these communicable illnesses, which, you know, we're still grappling with COVID, for example.
Yeah.
So the challenge is really like, yeah, how do we get away from this? How do we convince people that the science is legitimate and accurate,
Yeah.
and it's the right thing for them to do for themselves and for their families morally, as well as, I mean, just for their health, it's the right thing to do. But our media ecosystem is so toxic and so out of control that that's what we would typically be looking to. We would be like, oh yeah, PBS will run some stuff and educate the kids.
Right.
Like, no, that's not fucking happening anymore.
Yeah, they're
Sorry,
gone.
that's fucking gone.
Elmo's jobless now.
And
Yeah.
NPR will help us.
NPR.
No,
Yeah.
no, not helping.
No,
Although,
so
Stephen,
I
can I
don't
just
know.
say,
Not to
can
be a
I just
pessimist,
say,
but it does
no.
seem it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah.
Can I just say that there is something highly instructive about the fact that far right anti-vax people would not even understand the Nazis' own like thoughts on vaccination. It is so instructive because, again, like, we might like be 9/10 a Nazi, but like we're never going to admit it. We're never going to like actually be able to reconcile the fact that, like, oh wow, like many of our beliefs are like pretty consistent with like those beliefs of like early 20th century fascism. Like, I wonder what that means for us, right? Like, there's absolutely zero self-awareness. And
I mean, there are right wingers who think that Andor is right wing. So, like, I don't know what we do with them, right? Who are like, yes, we're the rebels.
And then of course there are the ones that like know that they're fascists and will
Sure.
either say that or they'll play coy.
Yeah.
And we're still, I think, in the play coy stage of things, although some of the recent DHS and ICE advertisements are trending in a direction. It's some interesting typographical choices.
defend our culture.
Typographical, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, typographical choices and phrasing choices that
Ugh.
are curious.
Fonts really will tell you a lot. And then also, I'm so mad that I have to think about Star Wars all the time. I don't like Star Wars. Okay, Andor is good, but like, oh my god. But like, they'll put up a video that's edited that cast themselves as Darth Vader, or will say like Anakin Skywalker, what a hero, and you're like, did you watch it? Did you watch the movie? And I guess they just are like, yeah, he's badass. Like, he does what needs to be done.
Yeah, media literacy is a challenge, and I've given up on the notion that art is going to be interpreted correctly. I don't know if there's even a way of correctly interpreting art, but I certainly have little faith that, you know, like, I mean, it can be helpful to people, but I'm not surprised that, you know, people are saying like, "Oh yeah, this is a right-wing show." I mean, people will project onto whatever they consume their own ideas if they are so committed to that, and it sucks.
Listen,
Yeah, I don't care about Star Wars either, so you know, I'm not a big fan. And it feels like yeah. I mean, let's just look at the original trilogy. Not to fucking continue talking about Star Wars, but it's
no,
like,
let's just do it. Let's
just do it. It's literally about an empire, like, you know, fucking going in and like doing bad things in like a desert planet during a period of time in which the Americans were very involved in the Middle East. So like, I don't know if you can't bonk people on the head much more than that with the context before you're it's not fiction anymore. It's just like a exposition of like, here's the politics that you should be taking away.
Well, like, if George Lucas, a man who wouldn't know subtlety if it took a shit on the end of his nose, right? He cannot get you to his point. It's not going to happen, right?
And to bring it back to our subject, I mean, yeah, like I'm glad to communicate about this stuff and put this stuff out there, but unfortunately, I do think it's like it's going to either fall on deaf ears, or it's going to be heard primarily by people who are already like interested or maybe even convinced or in support of it. And, you know, it does feel a little kind of disempowering to a certain extent. Like, what can you really do beyond protecting yourself and your community?
I have a story that might be a little more hopeful. It's from my own life. Let's see if it gives us a little more feelings. Okay. So my mom is, she's a British immigrant to the US, and she found a home amongst kind of like crunchy Northern California, like hippie type people. She started to hear the things about vaccines, that like the mercury is harmful, that the aluminum is harmful, that it will cause health problems, or it will overwhelm your child's body, and or maybe it will cause autism. We just don't know. And so when my baby brother was born, she put him on like a delayed vaccination schedule because she heard that that was safer from the crunchy people. And he did get them all, right? Don't worry, everybody. If you're looking to date my brother, he's single and vaccinated. But he did get them all. But afterwards, she said to me, "Caitlin, I have realized that that was wrong, that we should have done the standardized schedule. There's no reason. I looked at the evidence and there's no reason why we should have stopped." So like the people who are not all the way in the like, God will handle your body, don't touch it camp, they might be persuadable. We might get them. We got my mom. There's other people out there like her.
Yeah, you know, one glimmer of hope that is in the series, if you listen to it, is that one of the people I interviewed is Gare, who also contributes to Cool Zone Media and does stuff for It Could Happen Here. And they grew up in a community that was anti-vax, very religious, happened to actually have connections to major mega churches here in Texas, but they grew up in Saskatchewan, Canada. So they weren't even in the United States, and yet they were growing up with this sort of stuff. And they weren't vaccinated until they were older, and they were like a teenager and had finally gotten their control over their medical treatment. And it took them a little bit, because they also ended up moving to the Northwest after being in Canada, and, you know, got some exposure to the anti-vax stuff from the other side, as you described, the sort of hippie, crunchy alt medicine side, which at this point in time, I think as like a subculture is either dead or is dying, and has been more or less fully subsumed by the broader sort of right-wing anti-vax culture. Because
they're inside the like Maha bubble, right?
Like the vaguely conspiratorial stuff. Like, it used to be normal to be like, Monsanto is poisoning us, man. And like, you could kind of like shut that off a little bit, because like they were generally working towards like environmental protection and, like
This
policy
is all
goals.
my aunties growing up you're describing.
Monoculture farming's like not good, and it's also like fucked up to like sell these seeds to farmers and then like them not work because of some bullshit intellectual property stuff. Like, sure,
Yeah.
like all of that is fine.
The
but
shitty business practices side.
yeah, but there was always a tinge of it that was like conspiratorial for a lot of these people, and as that kind of has waned in liberal and progressive circles, those people have definitely been drawn over to the Maha, like kind of QAnon adjacent conspiratorial.
1000%.
Because if you go to those events, if you go to those kinds of conferences, like I unfortunately have, you will see there's, in the vendor areas, they're always going to have like people selling you some sort of magnetized card that's going to deionize your body or something, and in all these woo-woo type things. And so Gare got out of it and was able to get vaccinated and get away from all of that, but they were also a child. And it's good to know that like children who are in those situations can get out of it, but I also do kind of fear that that's maybe more of an exception than a norm, or at least at this
and they have to survive their childhood to get out of it, and like
right. And the other thing that they said was, well, after kind of separating from their family of origin a little bit and getting more of that freedom, they also were like, oh, I got diagnosed with autism. And I said, okay, so the vaccines didn't cause your autism because you didn't get vaccinated. Because
you had it already.
You were already autistic. You just didn't. Yeah. So, like little things like that, I think, helped kind of break some of the bind for people like Gare. But it does require like a certain set of circumstances that I don't know, they're hard to engineer. They kind of have to happen, and it's a personal journey, just like anyone's personal journey with regard to like changing their belief systems in any way, whether it's religious or political or otherwise.
We've talked about this with conspiratorial thinking, and that like it's not gonna be some like national message that's gonna cut through it, right? It has to be your immediate environment. We as humans respond to the people around us more than anything else. So
and it's not entirely like this, and not everybody who has these beliefs could be described as having almost like a cult-like identification with them. But for some people, I do think it is like basically extricating them from a cult, and like some of the same sort of methods or the same sorts of approaches that have been shown to work for getting people to remove themselves, because that's really the only way it can happen, is if they remove themselves from the cult. That's kind of how it has to
like your mind wants to defend itself against having to abandon something that's been so core to your being, right? So you're gonna resist it, and that's natural.
Particularly if it's wrapped up in your identity in any way, and you've made it like a part of your life, or if you have a business around it, or if you're a diehard in one of these scenes.
So you mentioned the tobacco thing, which I latched onto it and then have held onto it all this time. Like,
I'm impressed.
Because I think that it is instructive. There's a reason why in the Liberal Currents book list of books the editors think you should read, I put Creating Scientific Controversies, which talks about tobacco. And then I snuck in an extra recommendation, and no one yelled at me. Inside of that, I said it pairs well with Merchants of Doubt.
I did the same thing.
I was like, also, here's a sixth one. Don't tell me I can only do 5. Anyway, but the thing about the anti-vax movement and the tobacco movement, the tobacco industry, and a lot of other ones too, like the campus misinformation stuff. It's this use of freedom, and especially freedom of speech, as a Trojan horse to kind of move the conversation away from the merits of like, are vaccines important, to how dare you tell me that I can't say what I'm about to say, right? So like RFK Jr., for example, when he did this interview with Scripps News, and he talked about how like listening to experts are not science. I love that very much. Anyway, he was like explaining why he thinks he's doing a good job at HHS, and he said basically people are now free to ask the questions. People are now free to investigate, the ideas that have been forbidden up until now. Isn't that very amazing that we're allowing that to happen, right? Instead of doing his job, which is funding research into vaccines that can help us.
And it's no one was not allowed. Like, you were not banned from doing any of
Right.
that stuff ever. I
Yeah.
mean, to the point, very directly, we just were talking about people who have been doing this for years, like,
Right.
people who grew up in these communities well before COVID became the, cause celeb for this movement, and, gave them something to really latch onto and hone their message on. I mean, before that, people were doing this sort of stuff anyway. There are bookstores you can go to get a bunch of quackery if you want. It's not that it's not allowed. It's just that it's not been taken seriously, and it hasn't been accepted in scientific discourse. It has not been elevated into public policy discourse. It hasn't been given legitimacy until now. And so what
And
he's
that's
really
what they
doing
really
is
want.
he is
Right.
legitimizing these
Yeah.
people who
Okay.
are just asking questions, which is, as people often say, that's jacking off. They're just asking questions. You're JAQing.
It
I
is
mean,
fully masturbatory. It is. So, Trent, I promised this would happen. This is the portion of the program
Let's
in which I
go.
bitch about the conference I had to go to. So when I say had to, this is self-inflicted, right? So at Stanford University in 2022, there was a conference on academic freedom, and one of the panels involved Jay Bhattacharya, who co-authored the Great Barrington Declaration, right? So he was kind of an early COVID asshole. And so he was talking about how he had said early on that, like, COVID's not going to be a big deal. We should just, like, kind of let her rip. That was the idea. And that it's like an infringement of people's freedoms to make them do things like quarantining and masking
actually,
and stuff
what they
like that.
really wanted was to just only quarantine the old people or the
Yeah.
immunocompromised people too. They said, let's only do it for those. Let's only quarantine these people and let everybody else just do their thing. Which,
Right.
how would you even manage that? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know, but he wanted to. And so then he said he went to Stanford's campus and he saw that there were posters up that had like tweets of his on them, and also had like a graph showing the COVID numbers in Florida after he'd been advising DeSantis on what to do there. Literally just like statements of fact, right? Of like, here's what happened after they followed Jay's advice. And he said, to me, that felt like a physical threat. For 2 days, I did not come onto campus. And it's like, I don't know, man. Just saying what you did, not exactly a threat, right? And he also, in the same talk, was saying how all of these Republican politicians were just clambering over each other to get access to him and to give him fancy titles and to let him decide what they do in their states, right? So it's like, I don't know. I think you are suffering from wrong dinner party syndrome again. Like, you don't, you're getting all of these accolades from people who are like uncouth and unpopular, and you're not getting the accolades from like other Stanford professors, because that's who you really want, right? You want to be considered legitimate.
Right. I mean, it's also just another illustration of how all the bleeding from this particular side of this argument about how they haven't been heard or they were disregarded. I mean, it's just, no, like, these
Ron
guys
DeSantis called you on the phone, bro. I think you're good.
Yeah, I mean, these guys were getting attention, and they were being heard by policymakers. So it's just, it's so absurd. It's this like perpetual victimhood thing that is very common in that. And
I'm being silenced.
Yeah, oscillating between intense victimhood and then also, we can't get enough of winning. Are you sick of winning yet? So it just like, make up your mind.
I am being censored, and that is what I am entitling my Guardian piece. I am being censored. Well, Steven, certainly we're not censoring you, but unfortunately we got a boogie. We know you've got a boogie as well. But before we let you go, first of all, we have to have you come back to talk more about the worst things on the face of the planet.
That's what we're here for. We're going to change the podcast to the worst things.
It's very kind of you. It's very kind.
Absolutely.
Thank you for coming back.
Thank you for coming back. But again, where can the people read your wonderful work? Where can they listen to you?
Or listen. We're going to link to the podcast in the bottom.
Render
area.
us all the information, sir.
So I post somewhat regularly on Blue Sky. It's always a place you can follow me. I've got a link in my bio there that can take you to where you can read any of my stories. Also, it collects all of my podcasts as well. So if you're ever curious about what I've been working on, you can go and see it all in one place there. And I've got some projects in the works that should be coming out in the next couple of months. So keep an eye out for that. And anything else? I also publish a literary magazine, Protean Magazine. So check it out, proteanmag.com. A lot of good stuff.
Viewers
there.
can see it behind your head.
Yes. And that's about it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Steven. We will talk to you soon, I hope. This has been Half the Answer, where knowing the question is half the answer, or something like that. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Half the Answer, presented by Liberal Currents. You can find Half the Answer anywhere you get your podcasts. Liberal Currents is an entirely listener and subscriber-funded publication, which includes programs like Half the Answer and Neon Liberalism. So, if you like what you've heard and wish to contribute, you may do so at liberalcurrents.com and through Patreon. And remember, understanding a question is half the answer.